the updated Specialized Diverge gravel bike launched way back in May 2020, adopting the 2.0 version of the Future Shock, mountain bike inspired geometry, increased tyre clearances and new builds across the board. Since then, I have been testing the Diverge Comp Carbon, which is the cheapest version of the bike to feature the 2.0 version of the Future Shock. It comes with a Shimano GRX 810 level group set, sensible stout alloy wheels and an excellent build across the board. At a penny under £3,400, it is my pick of the bunch, though I wouldn't opt for the boring black one that Specialized has sent me. Before we crack on, thank you, as always, to our sponsors Freewheel for decking me out in my beautiful cycling kit in the riding shots in today's video. The Diverge is, without doubt, one of the most versatile gravel bikes I've ever ridden, and in my testing, I've really fallen for it. On the one hand, you could turn it to loaded touring, and on the other, it really builds up as a truly sprightly, go-fast gravel race bike. Now in this review, I am going to focus solely on my experience with this bike, the Comp Carbon, and if you want further details of the full range, or more details about the development of the bike, check out our original video from way back in May, and there's a link to that in the video description. For those of you that don't know, the Future Shock is a very simple suspension system which sits between the stem on the bike and the head tube, giving the cockpit 20mm of linear suspension travel. The Future Shock is the Diverge's USP. It is what makes it stand out in the increasingly crowded market of fancy go-fast carbon gravel bikes with suspension-inspired designs. Now I should preface this section by saying that when the Future Shock first debuted back in 2017 with the Roubaix, I was enormously skeptical of the concept. Now way back in the 90s with the Gervin Flex stem, I felt like we had already poo-pooed the concept of suspending the rider rather than the bike. Fast forward several years, and after a lot of time spent on the previous generation Diverge and now the new one, and I'm a convert. I love the Future Shock. It is a genuinely really good system that makes a big difference, particularly on longer days when it comes to reducing fatigue. Now the original version of the Future Shock was a more simple affair overall. It used 3 different swappable springs to suit rider weight and was non-adjustable. The Future Shock 2.0 kind of built on that concept, and that was first seen on the Roubaix back in 2019. With this, the system gained a lockout, as well as a simple single-circuit hydraulic damper, which controls compression and rebound. Now I didn't really find it to be a massive issue on the previous generation of the bike, but there is no denying that when you're climbing out of the saddle, the new system bobs far less. Now, whether it bobs or not doesn't actually matter. It's worth remembering that because all that is suspended is your upper body essentially, you're not affecting the ride feel or efficiency in the same way you would experience with mountain bike suspension. But nonetheless, it does bob less, and if you're kind of super sensitive to that sort of thing, it's a very welcome change. The new system also deals with big hits in a much more refined way. Now, it's not very difficult to bottom out just 20mm of suspension. If you are going for some big chundery terrain, or if you're sending it off with some sweet speed bumps, don't pretend you don't as well, it is very, very easy to bottom out. But as you reach the bottom of that travel, it ramps up in a more refined way than the previous system. The whole system runs on a set of roller bearings, and there's next to no stiction at all in the system. Even when you're riding over relatively smooth gravel, it is very active, and you can look down and see the little rubber boot satisfyingly squishing away as you go over small terrain. But for me, where the bike really shines is on longer rides. The difference it makes in terms of upper body fatigue is really noticeable. Even on the previous generation bike, when I, humble brag warning, did a really cool 280km coast-to-coast ride with my former colleague Joe. That was on that bike, and at the end of that enormous day, I was very impressed by how fresh I felt. But even over the course of a 3 or 4 hour ride, be on road or gravel with the new bike, you really do feel a difference, and that is for me where the system shines. Now, as I mentioned, the new Future Shock is adjustable. To adjust it, essentially where your top cat would normally sit on your stem, you have a small index dial. And from turning that through 90 degrees, you can go from fully open all the way to fully closed. The system is active enough without being too boggy and squishy, fully open, to make a difference, to make it more comfortable without wallowing through its travel. If you prefer a more firm front end, and it can feel nice if you're riding, on like a paved climb, you can fully lock it out and it honestly feels no different to an unsuspended bike. Finally, I think it bears mentioning the long-term costs of running a bike with a future shock. Now with Matthew's Roubaix, he contacted a local Specialized dealer and they quoted a nominal 500-hour service life for the cartridge. Now if you're a very dedicated rider and you ride on one bike alone, maybe you would hit 500 hours within a year, but when it does come time to replace or service it, you're only looking at like a £75 or £80 cost. Now that's a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but it's not a huge deal of money when you compare it to the servicing costs of, for example, a mountain bike fork. So it's worth considering, but it wouldn't be a buying decision that would sway me either way personally. Now, as I hinted to at the start of this video, this bike is available in two different finishes. The boring, austere, resale-friendly black that you see here, or, in Specialized's own words, a gloss ice blue, cast umber, chrome, wild ferns finish. You are a fool if you buy the black bike. Now there's further details in our original Diverge video, and I'm not going to repeat them all here, but as a brief refresher, the geometry of the new Diverge was largely inspired by trends in mountain bike geometry. Over the last few years, mountain bikes have on average gotten longer, slacker and lower, with reach numbers increasing, head tube angles slackening out and bottom brackets getting perilously low to the ground. The Diverge follows suit, and across most sizes you see a roughly 10mm increase in reach, a slightly slacker head angle in most sizes. To compensate, the cockpit has gotten shorter across the board, and you tend to see 80 or 90mm stems across most sizes. All of this means that you are less pitched over the front of the bike. That is the key thing when you look at the reach figures. With a shorter stem but a longer reach, the overall fit of the bike will be largely the same, but when it comes to steeper terrain, you are just not quite as far over that front wheel. The slacker head angle also makes a really big difference in rocky terrain, where it has less of a kind of nervous tendency to jitter around rocks, and it just feels more like a sled as you plough through. None of this is new, and none of it should come as a surprise. Mountain bike geometry has been moving this way for years now, and the kind of convergence between gravel and mountain bikes has been a long time coming. So I fully expect that again, other brands are going to follow suit, and we have already seen that from the likes of Lauf, with their new gravel bike very much inspired by mountain bike geometry. The bike veritably bristles with bosses, with mounts for 3 bottle cages, front and rear racks, a top tube snack pack, and mudguards. The one omission is a forward-facing mount on the front face of the crown of the fork. Now this is commonly used to mount dynamo lights, which on this kind of bike is not a totally unusual use case. There are also a few front racks in the market which won't play very nicely without that front boss, but it's a small omission and one I'm almost willing to forgive given the number of bosses elsewhere on the bike. I mention this in absolutely every review that I ever possibly can. I love mudguards. I live in the UK, I don't like having a wet bum. And to see them on a truly race-ready bike is no bad thing in my opinion. Good work, Specialized. All of this conspires to make the Diverge what I think is one of the most diverse gravel bikes from a mainstream brand on the market. You really could turn this to almost any task, from loaded touring all the way to ultra endurance, super fast, go fast gravel riding. The bike's near cavernous tyre clearance plays a really big part in this. With a 700C wheel set, you can fit tyres up to 47mm wide, and with 650B wheels, you can go up to 2.1 inches, or roughly 54mm. Finally, the bike adopts the SWAT downtube storage port chamber that was first seen on what is now the previous generation stump jumper. This essentially makes use of the fact that downtubes are quite big these days, and beneath the downtube bottle cage, you've got kind of like a plastic port with a really sturdy hinge, which allows you to stuff multi-tools, burritos, jackets, trail finds, what have you. My one criticism is levelled at the actual plate which forms the door to the SWAT box. This is a really small thing, but it did kind of annoy me. These small nuts, which sit on the base of the door to the SWAT box, these are not held captively within this plate. And as you can see, The bolts sit a little bit proud of the bottom of the plate. Now, when you're fitting this, it's really easy to drop these little nuts inside the frame. Now, retrieving them isn't too difficult, but I just wish that there was a little ridge on the base there to hold the whole thing in place. In summary, the spot box is just a nice thing to have. It adds essentially no weight to the frame overall, and it makes use of what is essentially redundant space on other bikes. And if it means you don't have to put anything in your jersey pockets and you don't have to run a handlebar bag, that's only a good thing in my eyes. Now we'll move on to the build, and we'll start off with the finishing kit. Starting with the front of the bike, we have the Specialized Adventure Gear Hover Handlebar. This design has been seen on Specialized bikes for quite a few years now, and has a very distinctive rise from the clamping area up onto the tops. I actually really like the overall shape of these bars. With 70mm of reach on the ramps, you have loads of room to move your hands back and forth. The drops themselves are plenty roomy, and personally, I prefer round tops for a gravel bar, and it's really nice to see that there too. And that's kind of how I would summarize the bars. You know, they're not too extreme in terms of fit or, you know, kind of gravel trendiness, and I think that's a really good thing to see on a stock bike. The only thing that really annoyed me about the bars is the limited clamping area by the clamp because of that little rise up towards the tops. With my Cat Eye Volt 1700 headlight, which uses a kind of a screw-on band, I couldn't clamp it down nearly tight enough without it wanting to slip up onto that riser section. If you're buying this bike and then everything after, it's not a problem. But if you're buying the bike and it's inheriting stuff you've already got, you're going to have to be very careful when it comes to fitting them to the bars. Out back, we see Specialized's nearly universally liked power saddle. The Roval Terra carbon seat post also adds a nice little bit of rear end compliance, with a little bit of fore and aft flex if you're seated when you're climbing on rough terrain. I was also really pleased to see a good old fashioned external seat clamp. An external seat post clamp holds the damn thing in place. It's really easy to deal with. I don't have to worry quite as much about torque settings. All good things in my eyes. Now this really deserves its own standalone video, but the bike is built with Shimano's GRX 810 level group set. GRX is Shimano's gravel specific group set, and this is actually the first time I've spent an extended period on it, and I have to say I'm a big fan. Now the 810 level GRX components are essentially Ultegra level, and as I've said on many occasions now, I think Ultegra R8000 is pretty much flawless. So it's no surprise to see that I did really like it. For what it's worth, this bike is built with a 2x drivetrain, with a 48-31 crankset matched with an 11-34 cassette. For the type of riding I enjoy, and in particular riding here in the southwest of the UK, a 2x setup makes a lot of sense. Though you will spend the majority of your time in the outer ring and rolling terrain, it's really nice being able to dump down into that little ring when you come to the bottom of a steep climb. If versatility is what you're looking for on a gravel bike, there's no denying that a double setup definitely makes sense. The wheel set is a really sensible and stout alloy option, with 24-hole DT Swiss GR 540 gravel rims laced to Specialized own cartridge-bearing bog standard hubs. Those rims have a mountain bike-like 24mm internal width, which plump up the 37mm Specialized Pathfinder Pro tires to a really nice rounded profile. The bike does not come set up tubeless as stock, which is a shame to see as some brands are now doing that, but to convert to tubeless wouldn't be a huge undertaking. The tyres are tubeless compatible, as are the rims, and all you would need is tape, valves and sealant. So not a huge outlay, and definitely the first upgrade I'd be making with this bike. The Pathfinder Pro tyres are a bit of a mixed bag. On tarmac or on hard packed trails, they are really fast. And their construction with that kind of really noticeable raised centre section rolls super fast on tarmac, almost feeling a bit like a road tyre. Likewise, if you're on dry trails and they're well surfaced, you know, the tyre itself has more than enough grip for that kind of gravel. They do, however, take a little bit of experimenting to get the most out of them when it comes to pressure. Now, I haven't set this bike up as tubeless. It is a review bike and it's going back to Specialized imminently. So I've had to set it up with tubes as standard. Now this means I've had to run ever so slightly higher pressures than I would with a tubeless setup to avoid pinch flats. As you lean over in, kind of tighter corners, you get this quite unnerving transition between the smooth section and the tread on the outside. Likewise, the tread is also pretty much useless in the wet trails we typically find here in the UK. There's no shoulder knobs, they're very easy to clog up in mud, and if there's anything approaching off camber, we'll call them thrilling. Now if I set the bike up tubeless and I played around a little bit more with pressure, I'm sure I'd be more satisfied with them, particularly on harder surfaces. One of the things that's actually really hard to assess on this bike is value. Now normally with, for example, a road bike, looking at the ranges across different brands, you tend to find an equivalent build from which you can compare. Now, there's no other Specialized Diverge on the market. The Future Shock is Specialized's own, so finding a comparison is a little bit harder. I think the closest equivalent would be something like the Cannondale Topstone Carbon. Now that's a gravel bike which, similar to the Specialized, infuses elements of suspension, with that particular bike using a shockless leaf spring system at the back and then its lefty Oliver fork on the front. Now then again, they are, yes, on the more technologically advanced end of the spectrum with gravel bikes, but the Diverge and the Topstone are quite different bikes. The Topstone is a more gnarly, I would say, trail-focused gravel bike, whereas the Diverge is more versatile and it's maybe better suited to lots of different things. So comparing the two is quite hard. And even if you took both of those bikes, you are paying a great deal for an advanced carbon frame and some fancy suspension parts. So if you look at other brands with more simple frames, there's no denying you can pay a lot less money for an equivalent or even nicer build. And if that's what matters to you, you may be better suited with one of those bikes. But for me, as a whole, as a platform, I really like the Diverge. I love the Future Shock, I think it makes a great deal of sense, and though I would likely build it up from a frame set to suit my incredibly esoteric tastes in bikes, as a whole package, the Diverge Comp Carbon comes very highly recommended. All in, I've really enjoyed my time on this bike. It's a truly competent gravel bike which could suit almost anything I can imagine ever wanting to do on a bike of that sort, and I'll be very sad to see it go. Please let me know if you have any questions about the bike in the comments. I do love reading them, I love hearing your feedback about our videos, my beautiful living room, and all the rest of it. And as always, do not forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon, so every time we upload a video like this, you'll get a notification.